About 4 years ago, I was a junior at a small college in LA County. Bordering my town was a large cavernous region known as Turnbull Canyon. It's the kind of place that has a healthy amount of creepy folklore surrounding it, with an area empathetically known as Hell's Gates. Stories of cultic activity, gang killings, abandoned mental institutions, and the like. The kind of shit you hear about any place old enough to have a reputation. In reality, most of the stories were spurned from a tragedy that occurred years prior. A woman's body was found at the base of a canyon, and from then on, the rest is history. Nevertheless, when a photographer friend asked me and another buddy to go out to the canyon in order to take some photos of the LA skyline, I had to oblige. The canyon was about a 30-minute drive from our campus, and we had been listening to the King of Limbs the entire drive, which proved to be the perfect ambiance to get me feeling pretty anxious about our little excursion. I should also note that I'm a pretty anxious guy in general, so traveling out to a remote area, preceded by its reputation for scary occurrences, admittedly had me thinking twice about the decision. At the top of the canyon, there's a small residential area, a few ritzy houses surrounded by trees and woods. In order to venture into the canyon itself, you have to follow a main trail with several smaller arteries that split off into other directions, but ultimately culminate at the base of a steep hill adorned with an old water tower overlooking the city. Anyhow, we parked our car at the top of the canyon road, divvied up the camera gear, and made our way out to the trailhead around 1 a.m. by this point. After walking the trail for about 5 minutes, Dave, the photographer, decided it was time to set up his first shot, while Jeff, our other friend, and I kept watch. Eventually, he got the shot he needed, and we continued walking for another 5 or so minutes before Dave decided to set up his next shot. At this point, the trailhead had disappeared behind us completely, and we were a little less than a quarter of the way to the water tower. While setting up the tripod, we noticed the faint glow of headlights off in the distance, which was strange because the trail isn't meant for cars, nor is it big enough for them to pass through. If I recall, it's only about 5 feet wide, with shrubbery on both sides. This was clearly a bit of a red flag for us, as we were the only people out there, so we immediately packed up our things and ducked off into the brush, waiting for the car to pass on. Eventually, an old pickup truck idled to a stop, about 50 yards from where we were hiding. The truck itself was old and rickety, sitting on a lifted chassis, the bed of which was missing entirely. Growing up in the country, I knew it as the type of truck typically owned by backwoods folks who lived in the boonies and preferred to be left to their own devices. We watched in agonizing anticipation as the truck just idled in place for several minutes before flooring it down one of the other trails, the roar of the engine echoing throughout the canyon. Clearly, we were spooked at this point, the three of us speculating as to our next step. Jeff and I were reluctant to continue, while Dave assured us that it was probably nothing, perhaps just a guy off-roading, as he put it. So with great reluctance, Jeff and I trudged on behind Dave towards the water tower to get his final shots. Nevertheless, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the truck. I mean, I knew plenty of people in high school who would go off-roading for fun in the woods, but never on finicky canyon trails, barely wide enough to even hike on, let alone drive. It just didn't sit right with me. After walking without interference for about an hour, we finally made it to the water tower, climbed up the hill to the top, and took in the view of the city. Dave, once again, started setting up his equipment, while Jeff and I stood on both sides of the water tower, keeping watch just in case the truck came back. Nothing. At this point, it's around 3 a.m. Dave decides that he's got all the shots he needs, so we pack up our equipment and commit to head back before it gets too late, seeing as how all of us have classes in just a few hours. Just as we're preparing to descend the hill, the truck comes roaring out of the canyon below us, back onto the trail, at which the driver attempts to climb the hill, revving the engine loudly. Scared shitless, the three of us slide off the side of the hill into the brush, clinging to plants and rocks. As the truck finally made it atop the hill, slowly driving around the tower, We could see the glow of the headlights each time it circled above us. After waiting for nearly 10 minutes, while also trying not to make any noise, the truck eventually descended the hill, stopping in the middle of the trail not more than 100 yards away. We watched as a scruffy man, mid-50s, stepped out of the idling truck and into the glow of its headlights, moseying around while looking at the ground. He then knelt down, looking at something in the dirt, surveying the area intently. As he did so, it became increasingly apparent that he was tracking something. Our footprints. This next part still chills me to the bone. As my friends and I huddled together, watching in complete terror, another man wearing a long, dark parka emerged from the brush, right where we had been hiking, joining the other man at his side. Apparently he had been out there the entire time we were walking the trail, just watching us, following behind at a safe distance. The two of them talked for a long while, but we couldn't hear a word. They continued scanning the area, looking at our footprints, but eventually got in the truck and drove off down one of the forks in the trail. We sat in silence for a long time, waiting nearly 2 hours just to ensure the coast was clear, at which point we made like hell back to the car, down the canyon, and back to our campus, just in time for class. This happened to me in the fall of 2002, when I was almost 9 years old and in 4th grade. It was an overcast day, typical of October in New England. I'd recently been given a lot more freedom by my parents, and I was allowed to stay after school for however long I wanted, or go down to the convenience store with friends. I usually just stayed for about a half hour and fought with people or played kickball. If my parents really needed me, they were only 2 blocks away and knew where to find me. This day, we were having a huge horse basketball competition. There were maybe 20 of us, all vying to win recognition from our peers and the many parents who were standing around watching. I think I was one of the few whose parents didn't pick him up anymore, and that meant I could outlast anyone who had an impatient mom or dad. Within about 10 minutes, half of the people were knocked out. We were 4th graders, and mostly white kids, or their parents had made them come home. And that's when I saw him. He was a middle-aged man wearing a brown corduroy jacket, standing by the fence that surrounded the blacktop, about 30 feet away from the other parents. But that's not why he stood out. 1, he was Asian, and my school was not a very diverse school. We had white kids and black kids, a few Indian kids, myself, and exactly 2 Asian kids, both from the same family. But they owned a restaurant, and I pretty much knew all of them. So who the hell was this guy? 2, he was shorter than every single parent, and he appeared to be shorter than me, though I was kind of tall for my age at the time. I kept looking at him throughout the game. He just had this look of content on his face. His thin but wide-stretching lips were slightly turned upwards. He was ever so pleased about something. I got knocked out 4th to last, but I stayed to see who won. I noticed that the man was now sitting on a bench, just a bit closer to everyone. One of my best friends got knocked out next, and then he and his mom invited me over to their house. I wish I had accepted the offer, but I couldn't because nobody in my family had cell phones at the time. My mom would be expecting me home when she got back from picking up my brothers at daycare. So I stayed until the end and was relieved when I saw the little man go out of the gate. But he didn't keep walking. He just stood outside the chain-link fence, facing the road. Just to be safe, I exited closely behind another kid and his mom, way the fuck across the blacktop at the other gate. After they drove off, I realized there was no one else left on the school grounds. There was just about half a block's length of chain-link fence between me and the man. I wanted to get into a friendly territory as fast as possible, so instead of walking down the main road towards my street, I sped-walked to the neighboring street. I wish I'd stayed on the main road. I turned around after crossing to find he had crossed the main road with me. I broke for the nearest house on the street that I knew of. It was the house of a kid in my class who had a really big dog, so I figured it would be perfect. I fucking machine gun knocked on his door, and loud. No one answered. Exasperated, I ran to the back. No dog. I ran back down the driveway and practically screeched to a halt when I saw the man turning around the corner and heading my way. I don't mean to offend the vertically challenged, but there's just something unsettling about a man whose torso is overly long and his head is too big for his body, contently half waddling down the street towards your 8-year-old self. But now I had a plan. There were several places between the houses on this street and my street that didn't have fences, or they were at least very short fences dividing them so you could walk right onto my street. We called them secret passageways. The nearest one was almost at the end of this block, and if I went through it, I would just be a couple houses past mine. I wanted the man to be taken aback when I effectively vanished down the block, so I went back to a spirited walk. By this time, it was drizzling, and I was covered in rain and sweat. My plan went off pretty much without a hitch. He followed me down the street on the other side, but when I got to the secret passageway, I made a sharp left and raced down the driveway, across the grass, jumped the short fence, across the next yard, ran down the next driveway, and all but leapt the street to the side my house was on. I looked around. He was nowhere to be found, and now it was raining in earnest, so I just casually walked up to my house, traipsed across the lawn, popped open the door, and breathed a sigh of relief. I wish I had kept to the front walkway. Now, it doesn't take a detective to spot size 7 footprints in the mud that led through a yard, over a fence, and through another yard. And it's still not difficult to find those same footprints in another yard, leading to the front door just a few houses away from where they stopped. I was sitting in my parents' room on the computer when I noticed a small figure out of the corner of my eye. My heart stopped when I saw him out the window, standing on the sidewalk, just staring up at me. It was raining buckets, but he didn't care. I ran to the phone, but my mom has a nasty habit of making 2-hour phone calls to her sisters and not putting the phone back in the charger. It was on her bed, and the red light was blinking at me. Well, I just lost it at that point. I buckled to the floor and started hyperventilating. What the fuck did this guy want? I was on my knees for the longest time, digging my hands into the carpet in a fury and despair. I could attack him. When I thought about it logically, he didn't seem like much of a threat, but maybe he had a weapon or something. I could just scream out the window at him, but I didn't really even want to know if he was still there. So I decided to bluff my way out of the situation. I taped 4 pieces of printer paper together and wrote in big writing in a permanent black marker, "I called the police." I crawled to the front window, and without looking out it, I just held up the sign against the glass. My hands were shaking, but I pressed them hard against the window, so they stopped. After what seemed like ages, I dared to peek out. He was gone. I told my mom when she got back, but she had a hard time believing that a small Asian man chased me home from school. Still, she picked me up from school for weeks afterwards, and I never saw him again. It's one of those things I remind my parents about time and time again, but every time I repeat it, it sounds like it was just a nightmare or something. But the sign existed up until I found it in 10th or 11th grade and recycled it. And I still remember exactly what he looked like, half waddling, and so pleased to see me. Hi friends, thanks so much for hanging out with me tonight. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you like this video, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you'd like to hear more from me. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you have a wonderful night. Please take care of yourself, and sweet dreams.